You ever have a moment where someone's expression tells you more than their words ever could? I mean that split second where the mask slips and you see something raw, something they didn't mean for you to see? That's exactly what happened to me. And if you're here, I know you came for an answer, not a teaser, not some vague mystery. You want to know why a trained doctor, a man who had probably delivered babies, fought for lives in emergency rooms, and dealt with the ugliest parts of humanity, looked at me like he'd just seen a ghost and whispered, "Leave her now." And I promise you, by the time you reach the end of this video you will have your answer. But before we get there you need the full picture. Because once you hear it there's no going back. Listen, I'm not the type who scares easy. I've been through enough in life to know that most problems have an explanation, even if you don't like it. But this didn't just feel like a problem. It felt like a warning, like someone had just handed me the keys to a locked door and told me never to open it. And the crazy part is, the warning wasn't about me. It was about my wife. The woman I've been with for nearly 8 years. The woman I thought I knew inside and out. You think you know the person you share a bed with, right? You think you know their habits, their secrets, their past. But what if you didn't? What if the person you loved was hiding something so deep, so dangerous, that even a doctor, someone who's sworn to help people, couldn't bring himself to say it out loud? And I'm not just telling you this like some campfire story, this is my life. This is the kind of thing you can't forget even if you try. Because when you watch someone's face drain of color in real time, when their voice drops so low you can barely hear it, when they say something that doesn't even sound real, it changes the way you look at everything. Every memory, every laugh, every late-night conversation. It all starts to feel staged. Like you've been living inside a play you didn't know you were part of. And trust me, you're gonna want to hear how it all unfolded because the truth isn't just unsettling. It's terrifying. It started on a Tuesday. Not the kind of day you expect your life to unravel. We'd been sitting in the waiting room for almost an hour. My wife, Emily, was scrolling through her phone, and I was flipping through an old magazine that was probably older than some of the nurses working there. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, and the muted beeping from down the hall was the only thing breaking the silence. You know how hospitals feel, like the walls themselves are holding their breath. She'd been feeling a little off for a few weeks, tired, lightheaded, headaches that didn't seem to go away. I thought it was nothing serious. Maybe stress, maybe low iron. I figured a quick checkup would set our minds at ease. I was wrong. When the nurse finally called her name, we went in together. The doctor, Dr. Harrison, was a tall, calm-looking guy, maybe in his late 40s. The kind of doctor who makes you feel like everything's under control just by the way he stands. He asked a few routine questions, checked her blood pressure, ran through the basics. Nothing unusual. Then he said he wanted to run a quick test, just to rule some things out. His tone was light, casual, but something in his eyes flickered. It was so fast I almost missed it. But it was there. 15 minutes later he came back. His face had changed. That's the part that keeps replaying in my mind, because it wasn't just worry. It wasn't just concern. It was fear. Real fear. He looked at Emily, then at me. His lips pressed into a thin line, like he was deciding whether or not to speak. And then, without breaking eye contact, he stepped closer, leaned just enough so his voice wouldn't carry, and whispered, "Leave her now." In that moment, my mind went completely blank. It didn't make sense. This was my wife. The woman sitting 3 feet away from me, looking at us both with a confused frown. And here was this doctor, a man I'd never met before, telling me to leave her like it was a matter of life and death. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to assume he'd mixed me up with someone else. But the way he said it, the way his hand trembled just slightly, told me this wasn't a mistake. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just ask him right then and there what he meant? Why didn't I demand an explanation? Trust me, I wanted to. But before I could get a word out, Emily asked what was going on, and Dr. Harrison's entire demeanor shifted. It was like he flipped a switch. His face smoothed over, his voice went back to normal, and he told her the test results weren't ready yet, that he'd call us in a few days. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me sitting there with my heart pounding and my mind spinning. Now I could have ignored it. I could have chalked it up to some weird misunderstanding. But something deep inside me, something I can't really explain, wouldn't let it go. Because you don't forget a moment like that. You don't forget the way someone looks at you when they've seen something they wish they hadn't. And as much as I didn't want to admit it, part of me was scared. Scared that I didn't really know the woman I'd married. Scared that maybe the doctor wasn't warning me for no reason. And that's where this story really begins, with a choice. Do you ignore the warning and hope for the best? Or do you dig even if you're terrified of what you might find? I made my choice. And that's when things started happening that I still can't explain. Because the first time I tried to get answers, something, or someone, made sure I couldn't. The days that followed felt strangely heavy, like there was this invisible weight pressing down on everything. I tried to go about life as usual, work, errands, small talk over dinner, but every time I looked at Emily I couldn't shake Dr. Harrison's voice from my head. Leave her now. Those 3 words had started to seep into every part of my day, playing in my mind at random moments, turning even the most ordinary things into something I felt I had to question. She'd ask me how my day was and I'd find myself studying her face, wondering if she could tell I was holding something back. At night, lying next to her, I'd notice things I'd never paid attention to before, the way she sometimes jolted awake, her breathing sharp and uneven, or how she'd lie there staring at the ceiling long after she thought I'd fallen asleep. We'd been married long enough that I thought I understood her moods, her rhythms, the little quirks she tried to hide. But suddenly, every detail felt loaded with meaning. Even our conversations felt curated, like she was choosing her words carefully, as though she was quietly managing what I was allowed to know. And that's where my mind started going in dangerous directions. Was I just being paranoid? Was the doctor's warning feeding some overactive suspicion in me? Or had I been blind to something bigger all along? I tried to remind myself that Emily had never given me a reason not to trust her. She'd been my anchor through job losses, family emergencies, and the countless small storms life throws at you. But the thing about trust is, once doubt creeps in, it's hard to get rid of. The first time I tried to dig for answers, it was subtle. I figured I'd call the clinic, maybe find out what test Dr. Harrison had ordered and whether there was anything unusual in the results. The receptionist's tone shifted almost instantly when I gave my name and asked about my wife. She put me on hold, came back a minute later, and told me the records weren't available yet. I knew that wasn't true. Lab results don't take days for basic tests. It wasn't what she said that got me, it was the way she said it. Like she was reading from a script. Like she'd been told exactly how to handle me if I called. That night, Emily was quieter than usual at dinner. I watched her push food around her plate, her mind clearly somewhere else. When I asked if she was okay, she smiled, a quick, small smile that didn't reach her eyes, and told me she was just tired. But it didn't feel like the truth. It felt like she was trying to end the conversation before it even began. I thought about bringing up the doctor's words right then, laying it all out and demanding answers. But some part of me held back, not because I didn't want to know, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to hear whatever she might say. In the days after that, little things started piling up. Once I came home earlier than usual and found her on the phone, her voice low and urgent, speaking in a tone I'd never heard before. The moment she saw me, she hung up, saying it was just a wrong number. Another time, I found her car parked 2 blocks away from our house when she claimed she'd been home all afternoon. And then there was the night I woke up at 2 a.m. to find her standing in the hallway, staring at the front door like she was waiting for someone. She didn't notice me watching. She just stood there for nearly 10 minutes before quietly locking the deadbolt and going back to bed without a word. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was stressed, maybe there were things going on with her family she hadn't told me about yet. But every time I thought about talking to her, the image of Dr. Harrison's face came back, along with that cold, whispered warning. It had been more than a week and I still hadn't gotten a call from him about the test results. So I went back to the clinic hoping to catch him in person. That's when things started to get strange in ways I couldn't ignore. When I asked to see him, the nurse at the desk told me Dr. Harrison wasn't available, that he was out indefinitely. When I pressed for more details, she just shook her head and repeated the same line. No explanation, no timeline. I left my number, but deep down I already knew no one was going to call me. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had made sure I wouldn't be able to speak to him again. And if that was true, then the question wasn't just what he had seen in Emily's test results. It was who didn't want me to know. That's when I started considering possibilities I never thought I'd entertain. Maybe this had nothing to do with her health at all. Maybe it was about something, or someone, from her past. I realized that while I knew the broad strokes of Emily's life before we met, there were gaps in her story I'd never filled in. Places she'd lived but never visited again. Friends she'd lost touch with abruptly. The way she'd once shut down completely when I'd asked about her old college roommate. At the time, I'd brushed it off as normal. Everyone has chapters of their life they'd rather keep closed. But now those missing pieces felt like locked doors, and I was starting to see the outlines of shadows behind them. I also couldn't ignore the timing. The last few weeks before this happened, Emily had been more distracted than usual. She'd missed a couple of work deadlines, which wasn't like her, and she'd started getting these late-night texts that she'd dismissively brush off as spam or wrong numbers. Once, when her phone buzzed and I glanced at it, she snatched it up before I could see the screen. She laughed it off, said it was just a silly meme from a friend, but I could tell she was lying. And if you've ever been in that moment, where your gut is screaming that something isn't right, you know how it feels. Still, I couldn't be sure what I was dealing with. Was this about a medical condition she wasn't ready to tell me about? Some dark secret from her past? Or was I getting pulled into something far more dangerous than I realized? Because here's the thing, around this time I started to notice things that didn't feel like coincidence. A car I didn't recognize parked on our street more than once. A man standing near the corner store who seemed to be watching our house. The sound of someone walking past our bedroom window at night when there was no reason for anyone to be out there. Each incident on its own could be nothing. Together, they felt like a pattern. And here's the part that really got to me. Every time I tried to bring any of this up to Emily, she'd change the subject. Sometimes with a joke, sometimes with a sudden, oddly timed kiss, sometimes by picking a small argument over nothing. It was like she had an entire playbook of ways to keep me from asking the wrong questions. Which made me wonder, maybe Dr. Harrison's warning wasn't about something that was going to happen. Maybe it was about something that had already started. The turning point came one rainy Thursday afternoon when I decided to stop waiting for answers to come to me. If Dr. Harrison wasn't going to call, if Emily wasn't going to talk, I'd have to dig on my own. I started by looking for the paperwork from the clinic, thinking maybe the lab test order or any handwritten notes might give me a clue. I keep most of our documents in a small fireproof box in the closet, the kind you only open when you have to renew insurance or file taxes. I remembered seeing the folder with Emily's recent medical forms there just last week. But when I opened the box, the folder was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. Every other file was there, neatly stacked, untouched. The gap where her folder should have been was so obvious it felt deliberate. I checked the desk drawers, the kitchen counter, even the car, but it wasn't anywhere. And here's the thing, only two people had access to that box. Me and her. That night I tried to play it cool. We watched TV, made small talk, acted like nothing was wrong. But I kept catching her glancing at me from the corner of her eye, like she was checking to see if I'd noticed something. When she got up to take a shower, I went straight to her purse. I know that's crossing a line, but at this point my curiosity had tipped into something heavier, a quiet, gnawing urgency. Inside, I found her phone, a set of keys I didn't recognize, and a crumpled receipt from a gas station nearly 2 hours away from our town. The date was just 3 days ago, on a morning she told me she was working from home. My hands actually trembled holding that piece of paper. When I heard the water shut off upstairs, I slipped everything back exactly how I'd found it. The next day, something happened that pushed my suspicion into fear. I got a call from an unknown number in the middle of the afternoon. When I answered, there was a pause, long enough for me to think it was a robocall, and then a low, flat voice said, "Stop asking questions about your wife." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood there for a few seconds, phone still in my hand, staring at the call-ended screen like it might give me answers. No one had ever warned me off like that before, not in my entire life. And if someone was taking the time to find my number and threaten me, it meant I wasn't imagining things. I decided I needed help, but I wasn't about to go to the police without knowing more. Instead, I reached out to a guy named Mark, an old friend from college who now worked as a private investigator. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew he could dig in places I couldn't. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a while before saying he'd look into Emily discreetly. He promised to keep me updated. For a few days, I actually felt like I had a lifeline. But then, out of nowhere, Mark called me back sounding unsettled. He said he'd found some strange overlaps between Emily's life now and something from more than a decade ago. I asked him what he meant, but all he said was, "I think she's been through something you don't know about, something big." He promised to send me a file with the details the next morning. That file never came. Instead, when I tried to call him the next day, his phone went straight to voicemail. By the afternoon, I got a text from his number that just said, "Can't help you anymore. Drop it." No explanation. No goodbye. It didn't even sound like him. More like someone else was typing from his phone. I drove past his office later that night and the lights were off, the blinds drawn. It was like he'd just vanished. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, though, that Emily's past and present were somehow linked. I started going through old photos looking for anything out of place. Most were harmless snapshots from vacations, birthdays, ordinary weekends. But in one picture from our 3rd anniversary trip, I noticed something I'd never seen before. We were standing in front of a little diner in a small town miles from home. Across the street, reflected in the glass of a store window, was a man. He was staring directly at us. Not smiling, not passing by, just staring. And the more I looked at his face, the more I realized I'd seen him before. The first time was just a few weeks ago, outside that corner store near our house. The second time was in the parking lot when I left the clinic after trying to see Dr. Harrison. He hadn't approached me either time, just watched. And now I couldn't shake the thought, maybe Emily wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Maybe someone else had been following both of us for a lot longer than I'd realized. That night, as I sat there with the photo in my hand, I heard the soft creak of the front door. I turned, expecting to see Emily coming in late. But instead, a shadow moved across the hallway, too tall to be hers. I froze, listening, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then, silence. When I finally stepped into the hall, the door was closed, the lock still turned, no sign anyone had been there. Except for one thing, on the floor, right by the doorframe, was a folded note with my name on it. I picked it up, unfolded it slowly, and felt my stomach twist as I read the words written in block letters. "You're looking in the wrong place." I stood there with the note in my hand, the words burning into my mind, trying to figure out if they were meant to help me or to throw me completely off track. The handwriting wasn't familiar, but there was something about the way the letters were pressed deep into the paper, like whoever wrote it had been in a rush or under strain. I slipped it into my pocket and forced myself to act normal when Emily came home an hour later, smiling like nothing in the world was wrong. I didn't mention the note, partly because I didn't want her to know I had it, and partly because I wasn't even sure what it meant yet. But the next morning, things took a turn I hadn't seen coming. My younger sister, Claire, called me out of the blue, her voice low and shaky, asking if I'd been messing with her mailbox. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about, and she said she'd found an unmarked envelope inside that morning. It didn't have a return address or a stamp, just her name written in the same blocky letters as the note I'd found. Inside was a single Polaroid picture of Emily. She was standing in a grocery store parking lot, looking over her shoulder like she'd just seen someone. Claire didn't know what to make of it, but she said the photo felt wrong. And when she asked if Emily knew someone might be following her, I realized I had no idea what to say. It wasn't just me being warned anymore. Someone had dragged my sister into whatever this was, and that made the threat feel more real, more targeted. I drove over to her place to see the photo for myself, and the moment I held it, a chill went through me. The date on the corner showed it had been taken only 4 days ago, a day when Emily had told me she was visiting a friend in another city. That meant she had lied, and someone else had been there to capture the proof. The problem was Claire didn't trust Emily. Not fully. She'd always been polite, always played the part of the friendly in-law, but I knew she thought Emily was too secretive, too careful. Now, with this photo in her hands, Claire started pressing me about what I really knew about my wife. She wanted me to give her the full story, but I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure how much of the truth I even had. And yet, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling Claire might already know more than she was letting on. The way she kept asking if I'd been checking up on Emily made me wonder if she had her own reasons for being involved in this. That night, I took the photo home and decided to do something risky. I left it on my desk where Emily could see it if she happened to come in. I wanted to see her reaction, to watch the moment she realized I had it. But when I came back from the kitchen, the photo was gone. I searched the desk, the drawers, even the floor. It wasn't there. I went upstairs, and Emily was in the bedroom reading like nothing had happened. I didn't ask her if she'd taken it, but I didn't need to. Her calm, steady smile when she looked up from her book told me everything I needed to know. The next day, something happened that threw me off completely. A man I'd never met before showed up at my office, asking for me by name. He was middle-aged, wearing a faded jacket, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged in the background of a crowd. He said he'd been a friend of Dr. Harrison and that he'd heard I was looking for him. He leaned in close, glancing around like someone might be listening, and told me the doctor hadn't left the clinic voluntarily. According to him, Harrison had been forced out after getting too close to a situation involving one of his patients. When I asked if that patient was Emily, the man didn't answer. He just handed me a small flash drive and said, "Be careful who you believe," before walking out the door without looking back. When I got home that night, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. There were only 2 files on it, both photographs, both grainy and slightly out of focus. One was of Emily sitting in a car I didn't recognize, parked in front of an old, weathered building. The other was of a group of people standing in a dimly lit room, and in the corner, partially turned away, was someone who looked like her. I stared at the photos until my eyes blurred, my mind trying to make sense of how they fit into what I thought I knew. But before I could dig deeper, I heard footsteps coming up behind me. It was Emily. She stood in the doorway, her eyes flicking from the laptop to my face, and for the first time since this started, she didn't try to hide the edge in her voice when she asked, "Where did you get those?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from an unknown number. I glanced at it and my stomach dropped. It was a photo of Claire, my sister, taken through a window from outside her house. Underneath was a single line of text. "Choose who you want to save." The moment I read that text, the air seemed to leave the room. I looked up at Emily, still standing in the doorway, but her expression had shifted from confrontation to something unreadable, like she was silently assessing whether I had just crossed a line she couldn't ignore. I quickly shut the laptop, my mind spinning with the image of Claire in that grainy, stalker-like photo. Whoever sent it wasn't bluffing. They had eyes on my sister and they wanted me to know it. I couldn't decide if this was meant to scare me into silence or push me into making a mistake, but either way, it meant the game had changed. This wasn't about suspicion anymore, it was about survival. The walls of my own home no longer felt safe, and the woman standing in front of me might have been the reason for it, or maybe just another pawn in whatever this was. That was the problem. I didn't know if Emily was the threat or the target, and not knowing was starting to drive me insane. I didn't tell her about the message. Not then. Instead, I shoved my phone into my pocket and told her I was going out for air, walking past her without looking back. My mind was a mess of half-formed plans and panicked thoughts as I got in the car and started driving with no real destination, just this gut-deep need to be somewhere else. That's when I noticed it, the black SUV in my rearview mirror. At first, I told myself it was nothing. A random car on the same route. But when I made 3 turns in different directions and it stayed behind me, never gaining, never losing distance, I knew it was deliberate. The driver kept enough space that I couldn't see their face, but the headlights followed every move I made. My hands tightened on the wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears, every streetlight throwing distorted shadows across the dashboard. I thought about calling Claire, warning her, telling her to get somewhere safe. But a part of me hesitated. If I called and she didn't answer, I'd know something had already happened. If she did answer, I didn't know what to tell her without putting her in more danger. That hesitation cost me because as I turned onto a quieter road to test if the SUV would follow, it suddenly accelerated, closing the gap between us. My instinct screamed at me to floor it, but before I could, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the same number. This time there was no photo, just a line of text that made my stomach clench. Asterisk, stop running. We'll find you either way. Asterisk. I pulled into a crowded gas station, hoping the public setting would make whoever was in that SUV think twice. When I glanced back, the vehicle had stopped at the edge of the lot, the tinted windows facing me like dark, unblinking eyes. I stepped inside the convenience store, pretending to browse the snack aisle while keeping them in sight through the glass. They didn't move. Didn't get out. Just waited. That's when I realized this wasn't just about intimidation. They were letting me know they could get close anytime they wanted, that they could watch me without ever touching me, and that the waiting was part of the message. By the time I got home, my nerves were stretched thin. Emily was in the kitchen making tea, her back to me, humming quietly like nothing had happened. I didn't ask where she'd been earlier in the day, and she didn't ask why I'd been gone for hours. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument. Later, when she went upstairs, I sat alone in the living room and tried to piece it together. Dr. Harrison's warning, the missing medical records, the gas station receipt, the man in the photographs, the note telling me I was looking in the wrong place, Claire's Polaroid, the flash drive, and now the SUV. Every thread led somewhere different, and none of them ended in a place that made sense. I couldn't sleep that night. Every sound outside had me peering through the blinds, half expecting to see someone standing in the yard. Around 3 a.m. I finally drifted off, but the relief was short-lived. I woke up to the sharp, echoing slam of the front door. I ran downstairs, my heart hammering, but the house was empty. The lock was still turned, the alarm system still armed. It made no sense, until I noticed the faint smell of cigarette smoke hanging in the air, the kind that doesn't come from an open window or a neighbor outside. It was inside, fresh, like someone had been standing in the room only moments before I got there. On the coffee table, next to the remote, sat another envelope. This one didn't have my name. It had Emily's. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing with whether to open it or not. But before I could decide, I heard the floorboards upstairs creak. Emily was awake. And for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't sure if I wanted her to see what was inside, or if I wanted to know before she did. I felt my stomach drop as the words left her mouth, because it wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, like she'd been waiting for the right moment to cut the floor out from under me. We were in my kitchen, the lights dim, a faint hum from the refrigerator filling the silence between us. I trusted this person for years, leaned on them when things got hard, and yet the way their eyes shifted, almost avoiding mine, told me they had been carrying something heavy and dangerous for a long time. The story they began to spill didn't sound like a rumor or a vague suspicion. It came in sharp, deliberate details, ones you couldn't invent unless you'd been close to it, living in the same shadow. And with every word, the past few weeks of my life started rearranging themselves in my head, forming a picture I didn't want to see. The doctor's whispered warning, the strange phone calls, the feeling of being followed, all of it seemed like scattered puzzle pieces until now, but her revelation didn't solve the puzzle. It just made me realize the picture was far bigger and far more dangerous than I could have imagined. She told me the woman I thought I knew, the one I'd shared years of my life with, wasn't who she claimed to be. Not completely. There were gaps in her past, years where she seemed to have vanished from any record, and connections to people who'd disappeared under suspicious circumstances. My first instinct was to shut it down, to push the words away because the alternative meant accepting that my home, my marriage, and my entire sense of safety were built on something rotten. But even as my heart pounded and my mind screamed to stop listening, I couldn't. Because tucked inside this confession was something that felt more immediate, more urgent. A clue that someone else had been watching me, someone who knew I'd started pulling at the wrong thread. Then she said it, the detail that changed everything. That warning from the doctor? It wasn't meant for me alone. Someone else had heard the exact same thing word for word months before. And that someone had vanished. The last person who'd been told to leave her now, never got the chance. They'd been gone 3 days before anyone realized they weren't just on vacation. No trace, no explanation, just an empty apartment and a phone that kept ringing to voicemail. My pulse felt like it was in my ears, and I could almost hear the weight of the silence between us after she finished talking. I wanted to demand answers. Who else knew, who else was in danger, and why she had waited until now to tell me, but the more I looked at her, the more I realized there was something else she wasn't saying. And that's when I caught it, a tiny tremor in her voice, a flicker of fear in her expression, not fear for me but fear of me. I could barely feel my hands as I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles whitening, my breathing shallow and uneven. Every part of me wanted to believe this was some kind of elaborate misunderstanding, but the way she kept her gaze fixed on the floor told me there was no walking this back. My mind began to race through every interaction I'd had over the past month, every strange glance from a neighbor, every missed call, every time my wife's voice sounded just a little too calm when she told me where she'd been. Now, sitting here, the truth wasn't just knocking at the door, it was pressing against my chest, forcing me to choose. If I confronted her, I might get answers, but I might also be tipping my hand, letting her know I was onto her. If I stayed quiet, I'd be stuck in this suffocating limbo, sleeping next to someone who might have been orchestrating something that could destroy me. And the worst part was, there was no safe option. Every path forward felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. She slid something across the table toward me. At first, I thought it was a folded napkin, but when I opened it, my stomach turned. It was a photo, grainy, clearly taken without my knowledge, of me standing in my driveway staring at my phone. In the background, half hidden by the angle, was my wife's car, parked down the block as if she'd been watching me. The timestamp in the corner was from last week. That was the same day she'd claimed she'd been running errands across town. My voice cracked when I asked where she'd gotten it, and that's when she finally looked up at me, her eyes sharp and wet, and told me I wasn't the only one under surveillance. Whoever was behind this wasn't just interested in my wife's secrets. They were building a case against me, twisting the evidence to make me look guilty of something I hadn't even done. Then came the ultimatum, quiet but razor sharp. Walk away from this, pretend I didn't know, and maybe I'd keep my life intact, or keep digging and risk losing everything, maybe even my freedom. The weight of it pressed down on me like a vice. I thought of my job, my home, my family's faces, and then I thought of living with the constant question of what she'd really been doing during those missing years. I couldn't tell if this was a threat, a warning, or a plea for help, and that uncertainty made my skin crawl. The air between us felt electric, like the moment before a lightning strike, and I realized no matter which choice I made, there was no coming back from this. It was almost midnight when my phone lit up with an unknown number, the kind of call that makes your chest tighten before you even answer. I stepped outside into the thick, damp air, putting as much distance between myself and the house as I could, because I knew whatever was coming, I didn't want her to hear it. The voice on the other end was low and urgent, the kind that skips introductions and jumps straight to the point. They told me I wasn't looking at a simple betrayal or a personal vendetta, This was an operation, one with layers so deep that by the time I realized who was pulling the strings, it would already be too late to undo anything. My wife wasn't the only one with secrets. So were our neighbors, my so-called friends, even people from my own family. Names started spilling into my ear like poison, each one making me feel smaller, more trapped. Some of these people I'd known my whole life, and yet here they were, linked together in something that felt like a shadow government operating right under our noses. When I asked why me, why my life, the answer chilled me to the bone. I wasn't just a target, I was a pawn. They needed someone exactly like me, someone with just enough credibility to be believed and just enough flaws to be discredited when the time came. Every coincidence over the past few months had been planted. The missing mail, the strange cars parked on my street, the sudden reappearance of an old friend who'd vanished years ago. It was all a pressure cooker designed to make me paranoid, to make me react in ways they could use against me. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone, to run back inside and drag the truth out of my wife, but before I could say anything else, the voice said one last thing. I wasn't the only one getting this warning, and if I didn't act immediately, the next person to vanish wouldn't be a stranger. It would be someone I loved. That was when I saw the headlights creeping down the road toward my driveway, moving slow like a predator circling prey. The car stopped just far enough away that I couldn't make out the driver, but I could feel the stare, like they were measuring me, waiting for me to make my next move. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone, and when I turned back toward the house, I froze. Through the kitchen window, I could see my wife on the phone too, her face pale, her eyes locked right on me as if she already knew who I'd been talking to. I walked back into the house with my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, the air inside feeling heavier than the night outside. My wife was still on her phone, but she hung up the moment our eyes met, her expression shifting from startled to unreadable in an instant. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were two people trapped in a game of chicken, both waiting for the other to blink first. I'd rehearsed this confrontation in my head 100 times, but now that it was here, I realized how different it was to stand in the same room with someone you love and suspect they've been orchestrating the unraveling of your life. My voice came out low but sharp, asking her who she'd been talking to, and I swear I saw her jaw clench, like the truth was something bitter she couldn't swallow. Then, in a voice that was almost too calm, she said, "You're not supposed to be here yet." Those words landed like a punch. I demanded an explanation, and she didn't hesitate this time. She told me everything, or at least enough to make me wish she hadn't. The phone calls, the missing pieces of mail, the friends who suddenly reappeared, none of it was random. It was all part of a controlled narrative being built around me, and she'd been in on it from the start, not out of malice, she claimed, but because they had something on her. Something she couldn't risk me finding out. I told her I didn't believe her, and that's when she did something I'll never forget. She walked over to the drawer by the fridge, pulled out a flash drive, and tossed it on the counter like it was a grenade. "That's everything," she said. "Every message, every file, every picture they've been keeping on you." My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop right there at the kitchen table, and the screen came alive with folder after folder of images, transcripts, and recordings that reached back years. Conversations I didn't remember having, photos of me in places I'd never been, bank statements from accounts I didn't own. It was a complete alternate history of my life, crafted to destroy me. I was so deep into the files that I didn't notice her step back until I saw her reflection in the darkened kitchen window, standing in the doorway with her coat on, holding her phone like she was waiting for a signal. I told her she wasn't going anywhere, but before I could move toward her, the headlights I'd seen earlier suddenly flooded through the blinds. The front door burst open, and a man in a dark suit walked in like he owned the place. He didn't point a weapon at me, but he didn't have to. The cold certainty in his eyes was enough. He told me it was over, that the truth wasn't mine to share, and that if I wanted to keep breathing, I'd hand over the flash drive and forget everything I'd just seen. My wife's face was pale and tight, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of me. I don't know what made me do it, maybe the months of feeling like a ghost in my own life, but instead of handing it over, I hit upload on my laptop. The files began streaming to a dozen backup servers I'd set up earlier that day, just in case this moment came. The man's eyes narrowed and he stepped forward, but that's when something unexpected happened. My wife moved between us. She told him if he wanted me, he'd have to go through her, and I knew then that whatever hold they had on her, she was willing to break it right there. For a split second it felt like we might actually win, but then the man smiled, pulled out his phone, and turned the screen toward me. It was a live feed from my daughter's bedroom. She was asleep, unaware of the camera, unaware of all of this, and in that moment I understood, this wasn't the end. It was just the opening move in a much bigger game, one that had just become terrifyingly personal. And as the feed went dark, I realized something else. Someone else was in the room with her. Someone I recognized. Someone I thought I could trust. The storm outside had long passed, but inside me, there was still a restless kind of thunder, the kind that lingers long after the lightning has gone. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands, staring at the scattered papers, photographs, and scribbled notes that had consumed my life for weeks. I knew now exactly who had been pulling the strings, how deep their influence went, and why they had chosen me, but knowing didn't feel like victory. It felt like carrying a weight I could never set down. The truth had cost more than I had imagined. Trust, safety, the few unshakable relationships I thought were untouchable. And as the morning sun began to creep through the blinds, I realized there was no going back to the person I had been before all of this began. The official story would never be told. The news would frame it differently, as they always did, twisting headlines into something clean and palatable for viewers who'd never know the reality, never feel the fear. But the truth was here in my hands, heavy and undeniable. Even now, the ending didn't feel like an ending. There were still pieces of the puzzle I couldn't place, names I recognized but couldn't connect, faces and photographs whose eyes seemed to follow me as though daring me to keep digging. The villain I had faced in the final moments wasn't working alone. I could see that now. They had been part of something larger, something sprawling and coordinated, something that didn't vanish just because I had pulled one person from the shadows. And yet I couldn't keep chasing it. Not right now. The people I loved, those who had survived the storm with me, needed me to stop before the chase swallowed me whole. The price had already been high enough, and part of me knew that if I stepped any further into the darkness, there would be no way back. But another part whispered that this wasn't truly over, that one day the knock on the door, the anonymous envelope, the shadow across my street would return to remind me that unfinished business never stays buried for long. For now, I told myself I could rest. I had survived the worst of it, outwitted enemies who had every advantage, exposed truths they'd spent years covering up. The constant paranoia, the long nights, the sound of footsteps behind me that weren't really there, all of it had led to this quiet morning. But as I sat there, staring at a single slip of paper that had been left on my front porch just before dawn, I realized peace was only an illusion. The note was short, written in the same hand that had started all of this, the one I had convinced myself was gone for good. It didn't threaten me directly, didn't name names, didn't tell me what was coming. It simply read, asterisk, you only found the first door. Don't open the next. Asterisk, and for a moment I couldn't tell whether the fear curling in my stomach was because I believed them, or because I knew I eventually would.